Beautiful, exquisite film. I love these stories that bank off of something that you knew. So we all have heard of Norman Rockwell, and I'm just wondering.
Please use the mic.
It doesn't work, unfortunately.
Hello? Oh, it is. Mine's on.
Okay, we'll share this one. This is one of those stories that just sort of brings you in on a different angle, on something that, a world maybe that you were vaguely familiar with, the world of advertising, a figure like sort of Norman Rockwell. Where did the journey begin for you, the interest in sort of telling this story? Was it to tell a love story? Was it to tell a story about representation? Was it to talk about advertising? Where did it begin for you?
It definitely didn't begin with a love story. I knew nothing about the love story when I started this film. But similarly, of course, I've heard of Norman Rockwell. I think he's a part of American consciousness. And J.C. Leyendecker, as the film kind of explains, has become sort of a footnote. So I had never heard of him, even as a gay person, which I think is quite shameful. I'd never heard his name before. I made a documentary series for Apple TV Plus right when it launched in 2019 about the history of LGBTQ plus representation on television, specifically. So it was a 5-episode series. It went in chronological order. So our first episode began in the 1940s and 1950s with the advent of television. And the first storyline we explored in that series was the Army McCarthy hearings, which is the first time it was the word homosexual was used on television, and obviously it was not in a nice manner. But in doing the research on that storyline and what led up to the Army McCarthy hearings is when I discovered in my team's research that there had been this era, which many people refer to as the pansy craze. Transparent did a whole season about it in Berlin. But this era before the Great Depression and World War II, where there had been an incredible amount of LGBTQ progress, and that kind of blew my mind, but it didn't fit into the story of Visible because that began with the beginning of television. So I had always wanted to find a story in that world. I thought it might be scripted because it was such an old world. And then I was approached during COVID about making something similar to Visible, which was about television, but in the world of advertising. And a few storylines were thrown at me, and one of them was J.C. Leyendecker. And so the amazing woman in my film, Judy Cutler, who's the red-haired woman, who's really one of the only reasons J.C. Leyendecker is still a name today is solely because of this woman who has kept his name alive and his artwork alive for 50 years. She literally wrote the book on him. There's only one book about him. Someone sent me the book and I read the book and the story just blew my mind. And that was sort of the genesis of the project, was why have most of us heard of Norman Rockwell and why is he such a huge part of the American art canon, but J.C. Leyendecker isn't. And I wanted to know more about him.
I loved, here we have I can take that one. I love the way that you open the piece. We talk a lot about the power of film, the power of nonfiction, the power of fiction storytelling, but not a lot is talked about in terms of the power of advertising and what can happen in advertising. How much of that what was part of your intention of sort of exploring sort of how we see each other and are seen through the advertising that we do and sort of what impact that has?
Yeah, and we actually left advertising out of Visible, that series that we made, because we had to draw a line somewhere because there's been such an abundance of television, and we had a part about commercial advertising history and LGBTQ plus representation that ended up on the cutting room floor. But yeah, I think, I had no idea the history of illustration itself as sort of an art form that's been looked down upon in many ways because it was mass produced, because that's what illustration is. And so, J.C. Leyendecker, although he's, a very fine artist and his artwork now finally is starting to sell for good amounts of money, in many ways, was looked down upon, and so was Norman Rockwell for a long time because their art was used in a ways to sell things or with messaging. And so that was sort of a current throughout the film, and that's why we did the story of Subaru. And we also did the story of Yari Jones, who's the black trans model, who's now the face of Calvin Klein, was always kind of using advertising, using what J.C. Leyendecker did with his muse Charles Beach, and figuring out a way to tie that past to the present in various storylines that have rippled over the years. A few actually got cut out that I love, but those were the two that ended up staying in the film in the end, with Subaru and Yari.